Welcome back. In the first mini lecture, I tried to get you to appreciate this notion that when we look at the presidency, we need to look at both the unique individual people who occupy the office, presidents, and the various roles and expectations that presidents play, the presidency. So when we look at this topic, we're looking at both unique individuals and a constitutionally defined office. At the end of the mini lecture, I tried to point out that perhaps the place to start, certainly the place that I always start when I look at um, a political office, a political role, whether it is a Supreme Court justice, whether it is a congressperson, whether it is a president. To me, the most important part about presidential or congressional or judicial philosophy is how do they define their own role? And if you take a look at the Constitution in Article 2, which deals with the presidency, has a very ambiguous beginning. I read it at the end of the last presentation. I'll restate it. The executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. Many presidents have defined this as nothing more than a title. It has no special meaning, no special relevance. For other presidents, they believe that that particular sentence gives them vast implied powers. And certainly that's Donald Trump's philosophy. President Trump, in essence, has echoed Richard Nixon's famous statement that if the president does it, that means it's not illegal. And on numerous occasions, President Trump has alluded to look at Article 2. It means that I can do virtually anything. And so he's not the first one to hold this, but he is the first one that I've ever heard who has expressed this view this often. Your book discusses a term that I hadn't heard before. Your book uses the term a dormant presidency. I'm going to use the term literalist presidents. And I want you to write something down in the margin of your notes, put some stars next to it. You're very likely to see this on the next exam. And that is before the New Deal, powerful presidents were the exception, all right? So that doesn't mean that there weren't powerful presidents before the New Deal, before Franklin Roosevelt. But you've got to keep in mind that the United States was not a world power until the 20th century. Certainly, there were events that did make for a few presidents before Franklin Roosevelt. Obviously, Thomas Jefferson in the Louisiana Purchase, James K. Polk in the Mexican-American War, Abraham Lincoln in the Civil War and his Emancipation Proclamation freeing slaves. But the dominant view of most presidents and the dominant view of the American public was that powerful presidents were threats to representative democracy. Certainly, the notion was that Congress should be the leading branch of government. That was the original constitutional design. It was the most representative of the branches. But from the very beginning, presidents began to stake out some turf or some territory. And one of the things that I like in your chapter on the presidency, which I believe is a very well written chapter, you know, from time to time I've taken pot shots at the book, but I'm going to give it some credit in this particular chapter. I like how Greenberg and Page point out that George Washington, very early, at the very start of his presidency, reaffirmed the notion that when it comes to foreign affairs, the president is the primary officer. Despite that fact, follow along now, I'm going back to your notes. Literalists, people like William Howard Taft, people like James Buchanan, believed that the president had enumerated powers only. In other words, that opening line of Article 2 was just a designation of office, it was just a title. It did not give them any specific powers at all. And so you're not going to have to worry about checks and balances or separation of powers with presidents who view their office as literalists because they are going to limit themselves. The Constitution gives the vast majority of power to the Congress. And so these presidents are going to tend to be reactive presidents. They are going to wait for the Congress to initiate legislation, initiate a budget. Certainly, they have some powers. They have a very powerful negative check. Certainly, they have the veto. But the idea of the literalist presidents are that Congress is going to lead, Congress is going to govern. I'm going to be a check and a balance in veto legislation. I'm going to make some recommendations for legislation. And if we were to get involved in a war, then yes, I will assume more powers as commander in chief. And so, what do I want you to know about literalists? I want you to know that this was the dominant view of presidents and of presidential power before the Great Depression. I want you to know that before the New Deal, powerful presidents were the exception. Your book then talks about the modern or the 20th century president. I'm going to refer to these presidents as stewards or stewardships. These would be presidents like Teddy Roosevelt, presidents like Abraham Lincoln, who believed that that opening sentence of Article 2 gives them vast implied power. So Teddy Roosevelt believed that that was an opening. I've talked a lot about implied powers. I talked about implied powers frequently when I was talking to you face to face, when I was mentioning federalism and the notion of implied powers. And does the national government have literal language? Powers beyond that literal language. Now I'm coming back to that notion. There are many presidents like Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, in fact, most presidents since World War II believe that they do have implied powers. Richard Nixon and Donald Trump probably more than any president in the post-World War II era. These presidents are going to stretch the powers of the presidency routinely. And this has been the dominant view or the dominant interpretation of the presidency since the Great Depression. I've mentioned the Great Depression many times. I've told you how I believe that this is the second greatest crisis in American history after the U.S. Civil War. One of my favorite political commentators, a man named Theodore Lowy, uh, coined this phrase, the personal presidency. I put several stars here. I have it underlined in your notes. Put 5 stars to it. That's what I would do if I were face to face and were writing this on the board. According to the personal presidency, people now expect the president to get us what we want from government. And so the idea of the New Deal was that it created this new relationship between the people and the presidency. Before the Great Depression, the dominant view was that presidents were kind of cool and aloof. They were kind of like distant fatherly figures that weren't very connected to us on a personal level. We understood that presidents were important people. We understood that presidents do important things, but they were somehow kind of removed from our lives, and we certainly weren't expected to ask anything specific from these individuals. But with the Great Depression and with the New Deal, we've changed our philosophy of presidential power and we've changed our philosophy of presidents. Instead of seeing presidents as threats to representative democracy, we now expect the president to be our personal diplomat, our personal envoy, and we now want the president to get us what we want from government. And so whether it is something like Social Security, whether it is something like the National Highway Act, the Interstate Highway Act, whether it is Medicare, Medicaid, more recently we've been talking about perhaps national health care. We expect that it is the president that is going to be at the center of this process and that it is going to be the president that is the locomotive that drives that legislative agenda forward. One of the great problems that Lowy points out is that presidents, when they are candidates and they are running for office, they almost invariably, and this is true of both political parties, and this is true of virtually every presidential candidate that I've ever seen, and that is they inevitably promise more as a candidate than they can deliver as a president. And as a result, presidents kind of become victims of representative democracy. And the main result of that, and put some stars next to this, is that poll ratings tend to fall over time. The two most noteworthy exceptions to this tendency of falling poll ratings are Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton. Interesting because Bill Clinton, of course, is one of only three presidents to be impeached while he was president. And while he survived this impeachment quite easily, it still is intriguing that this man who was impeached retained his public approval ratings. And in my opinion, if we didn't have term limits on the presidency, he would have won a third term of office easily, even though he was impeached by the Congress. One of the big questions, though, is when you take a look at presidents, there is a huge debate over how powerful is this office. Yes, presidents define their role differently. Some have tried to be more assertive, some have tried to be more reserved. But your book points out several things about the presidency, and that is that there are lots of limitations on presidential power. One of the limitations on presidential power, of course, is that our founding fathers established a system of separation of powers and of checks and balances. And so most of the powers that are important are really shared powers, that the president has to share these responsibilities with the Congress. And so separation of powers makes presidents somewhat reactive at times. So presidents surely can propose or veto legislation. However, Congress has to pass the legislation. Presidents can negotiate treaties, but the Senate must confirm them. Presidents can nominate Supreme Court nominees, but the Senate must confirm them. Presidents also can be weakened if the Congress is dominated by the other party. If you have a Republican president and a Democratic Congress, presidents aren't going to get nearly as much done. And an additional thing that really weakens presidents that your book points out is that, unlike in a lot of countries, for example, in Great Britain, where all the legislative elections are at the same time, and then the legislators in the House of Commons choose the prime minister. In presidential elections, only a third of the Senate is up for re-election when presidents are. Two-thirds of them are not. Now, obviously, presidents are going to be a lot more powerful if we're not dealing with divided government. When presidents have a majority in both houses of Congress, it means that more legislation is going to be passed. It means that Senate confirmation of, for example, Supreme Court nominees are going to occur much more with a lot more reliability. It means that in general, the legislative process is going to be easy because they share common values and policy preferences. And your book points out a great example of a president being strong because of these factors, because of not dealing with divided government, with having legislative majorities. Your book points out that during Barack Obama's first 2 years as president, he had the highest presidential success score with Congress since 1953, when those statistics started taking place. Notice, however, that over time, Obama's success diminished dramatically because the Republicans took over the Senate. And the best example of the Republicans stymieing Obama was when Obama wanted to nominate Merrick Garland to the Supreme Court, and Mitch McConnell, the leader of the Senate, refused to even have a Senate vote on Merrick Garland. And as a result, Obama did not get that nomination. Donald Trump became president. he then submitted a nominee to the court, and so that nominee was then confirmed by the Senate.